The crash happened 3 days ago, and Hyun was still picking metal fragments from his palms when he heard the sound. A soft whimpering, like a kitten calling for its mother, came from beneath a twisted piece of his transport ship's hull. His ribs ached as he bent down to lift the debris, expecting to find some injured native animal he could help. What he found instead made his blood run cold. The creature was no bigger than his closed fist, covered in scales that shifted from deep purple to black, depending on how the light hit them. Its body looked like a miniature dragon from old Earth stories, but its eyes were what made Hyun's hands shake. They glowed a deep crimson red and seemed to track his movements with an intelligence that shouldn't exist in something so small. The little beast opened its mouth, revealing tiny needle-sharp teeth, and made that pitiful mewing sound again. Hyun had been a xenobiologist before the crash stranded him on this primitive world. He'd studied hundreds of alien species, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the mixture of fascination and terror he felt looking at this tiny predator. Every instinct told him to leave it there, but something about its helpless cries tugged at his heart. He was still staring at the creature when voices echoed through the crash site. The Kitharan hunting party appeared between the trees, their bronze spears glinting in the afternoon sun. Their leader, a scarred warrior named Jorik, took one look at the creature in Hyun's hands and stepped backward so fast he nearly tripped. "Deathspawn," Jorik whispered, and the other hunters began making protective gestures with their hands. "The Shadowbringer. You must kill it now, Skyman, before it grows." Hyun looked down at the trembling creature. It had curled up in his palm like a sleeping cat, its red eyes now closed. "It's just a baby, it can't hurt anyone." "You do not understand," another hunter said, his voice tight with fear. "My grandfather's grandfather spoke of these beasts. They are the reason our people learned to fear the darkness. One shadow spawn can destroy an entire village when it reaches full size." The hunters formed a circle around Hyun, their spears pointed not at him but at the small creature he held. Jorik pulled a curved dagger from his belt. "Give it to me, Skyman. I will make the death quick." That's when Princess Nari stepped out from behind a tree. Hyun had met her twice since his crash, and both times her intelligence had impressed him more than her beauty. She was the only person in the tribe who asked questions about his world, instead of just staring at his strange clothes and pale skin. "Lower your weapons," she commanded, and the hunters reluctantly obeyed. Her dark eyes studied the creature, in Hyun's hands with curiosity rather than fear. "This Skyman saved 3 of our children from the river yesterday. If he believes the creature should live, perhaps we should listen." Jorik shook his head violently. "Princess, with respect, your father would order its death immediately. These creatures are forbidden by the oldest laws." Nari was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked directly at Hyun and said something that would change both their lives forever. "Can you make it to the forest before sunset?" Hyun understood immediately. She was giving him a chance to escape. "Why would you help me?" "Because," she said softly, "sometimes the most dangerous choice is also the only right one." As the sun began to set, Hyun ran through the alien forest with the tiny creature pressed against his chest. Behind him, he could hear Princess Nari arguing with her hunting party, buying him precious time. The little beast opened its red eyes and looked up at him, and for just a moment, Hyun could have sworn it smiled. "I guess I'll call you Shadow," he whispered, as they disappeared into the wilderness together. 3 months in the wilderness had changed everything. Hyun barely recognized the creature that now prowled around their makeshift camp. Shadow had grown from the size of his fist to nearly as large as a wolf, its obsidian scales now gleaming like polished armor in the firelight. But it wasn't just the size that made Hyun's stomach twist with unease. It was the way Shadow watched everything. The creature no longer just ate and slept like a normal animal. Instead, it would sit motionless for hours, its burning red eyes studying the forest around them. Hyun had caught it several times, arranging small stones and sticks in complex patterns, almost like it was planning something. When he asked Shadow what it was doing, the creature would tilt its head and make a sound that was almost like laughter. "You understand me, don't you?" Hyun whispered one evening as Shadow sat perfectly still, staring into the darkness beyond their camp. The creature turned its massive head toward him, and those crimson eyes seemed to bore straight into his soul. For just a moment, Hyun could have sworn he saw something ancient and calculating looking back at him. That's when the hunting party found them. Captain Tae emerged from the tree line with 12 of his best warriors, their weapons drawn and ready. Hyun recognized the captain immediately. He was Princess Nari's personal guard and one of the most skilled fighters in the tribe. The man's face was grim as he pointed his spear at Shadow. 3 months we have tracked you, Skyman, Tae called. Out. 3 months of torn livestock and frightened villages. The beast must die today. Hyun stepped protectively in front of Shadow, though he knew it was pointless. The creature was easily large enough now to defend itself, but some part of him still felt responsible for protecting it. Shadow hasn't hurt anyone. The missing animals could be from any predator in these forests. Look at its eyes, fool, one of the warriors shouted. They glow with hunger for blood. That's when Princess Nari stepped out from behind the hunting party. Hyun's heart jumped. He hadn't seen her since the night she helped him escape. She looked different now, more serious, with worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. I had to come, she said simply. I had to see what you've been hiding out here. Before Hyun could respond, a low growling sound echoed through the forest. But it wasn't coming from Shadow. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, its body tensing like a coiled spring. 6 massive shapes moved through the trees around them. Razorback hounds, the most dangerous predators on Kithara. Each one was easily twice the size of Shadow, with claws that could cut through tree trunks. The hunting party immediately formed. A defensive circle. But Hyun could see the fear in their eyes. Razorback hounds hunted in packs and rarely left survivors. Even Captain Tae's legendary skill wouldn't be enough against 6 of them. That's when Shadow moved. What happened next made Hyun question everything he thought he knew about his companion. Shadow didn't just attack the Razorback hounds. It systematically dismantled them. The creature seemed to know exactly where each predator would move before they moved. It would strike at one hound's leg, crippling it, then immediately leap to another's throat with surgical precision. But what truly terrified Hyun was the look in Shadow's eyes during the fight. There was no wild animal fury, no desperate survival instinct. Instead, there was cold, calculating intelligence. Shadow was solving the problem of 6 dangerous predators like it was working out a puzzle. Within minutes, all 6 Razorback hounds lay dead around their camp. Shadow sat calmly in the center of the carnage, licking blood from its claws with what almost looked like satisfaction. Princess Nari stared at the scene with wide eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Hyun, what exactly have you created? By the 6th month, Shadow had grown to the size of a small horse, and Hyun was starting to lose sleep. Not because he was afraid of the creature. Shadow had never shown any aggression toward him. It was because of what he witnessed every single day that made his hands shake when he tried to eat his morning meal. Yesterday, Hyun had watched Shadow solve a problem that would have challenged most humans. A fallen tree blocked the path to their water source, too heavy for either of them to move alone. Instead of finding another route, Shadow spent 20 minutes studying the situation. Then it began systematically removing smaller rocks and branches, creating a lever system that allowed them to shift the massive trunk with minimal effort. That's engineering, Hyun muttered to himself as Shadow stepped back to admire its work. You're doing actual engineering, but the real changes started happening at night. Hyun had always been a light sleeper, a habit that had saved his life more than once during his years of deep space exploration. So when Shadow began leaving the camp after midnight, Hyun noticed immediately. The first few times he assumed the creature was just hunting for food. Shadow would disappear into the darkness and return before dawn with fresh meat for both of them. Then Hyun started paying closer attention to what Shadow brought back. The meat was always perfectly prepared, cleaned, portioned, and somehow preserved in a way that kept it fresh for days. More importantly, the animals Shadow killed were always the most dangerous predators in the area. Creatures that had been terrorizing the local villages for months would simply vanish overnight, and Shadow would return looking satisfied. Where are you going? Hyun asked one evening as Shadow prepared for another nighttime excursion. The creature paused at the edge of their camp and turned its massive head toward him. Those red eyes seemed to study Hyun for a long moment before Shadow made a sound that was almost like speech, a series of clicks and growls that felt like they had meaning. The next morning, Hyun woke to find something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the dirt around their campfire was a detailed map of the surrounding territory. Not just the basic layout, but specific information about water sources, dangerous areas, and what looked like patrol routes of the local tribal hunting parties. The level of detail was incredible. It showed things that would take a human scout weeks to discover. Shadow sat nearby watching Hyun examine the map with what could only be described as pride. "You drew this," Hyun said, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't a question. You've been scouting the entire region while I sleep." Shadow tilted its head and made that almost speech sound again. This time, Hyun was certain he heard actual words buried in the growls. The creature was trying to communicate something complex, something important. That afternoon, Hyun decided to follow Shadow on one of its expeditions. He stayed far behind, using his xenobiology training to track the creature without being detected. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about their relationship. Shadow wasn't just hunting randomly. It was visiting specific locations. A watchtower used by tribal scouts, a crossroads where merchants traveled, a cave system that served as a hideout for bandits. At each location, Shadow would spend several minutes observing, sometimes making those scratch marks in the dirt that Hyun now realized were notes. The creature was gathering intelligence, systematic, detailed intelligence about every threat and resource in a 50-mile radius. When Hyun confronted Shadow about it that evening, the creature did something that stopped his heart. It looked directly at him and spoke a single word in perfectly clear human speech: partnership. Hyun stared at his companion, finally understanding the terrible truth. He hadn't rescued and raised a wild animal. He hadn't even tamed a dangerous predator. Somehow, without realizing it, he had entered into an alliance with something that might be far more intelligent than he was. "What do you want from me?" Hyun asked. Shadow's red eyes gleamed in the firelight as it answered with two more words that changed everything: mutual benefit. That night, Hyun lay awake wondering who was really in control of their partnership and whether he should be grateful or terrified by the answer. The first sign of trouble came with the smoke. Hyun spotted it from their hilltop camp, thick, black columns rising from the direction of the nearest Kitharan village. Shadow immediately stopped what it was doing, its massive head turning toward the distant smoke with an intensity that made Hyun's stomach drop. The creature's red eyes seemed to glow brighter as it made a low rumbling sound that Hyun had never heard before. "What is it?" Hyun asked. But Shadow was already moving toward the edge of their camp, its body tense like a predator preparing to strike. The answer came 3 days later, when the first refugees stumbled into their territory. Hyun found them collapsed near a stream, an elderly Kitharan man carrying a wounded child on his back. The old man's eyes were wide with terror, and he kept looking over his shoulder like something was chasing him. When he saw Hyun, he grabbed his arm with desperate strength. "The sky demons have come," the old man gasped. "They came from the stars like you, but they bring only death. Their weapons shoot lightning, and their armor turns our spears to dust." Hyun's blood went cold. He had heard stories about the Vorthak from other worlds, a brutal race of conquerors who traveled from planet to planet, enslaving or exterminating any species they encountered. They were everything that humanity wasn't: cruel, efficient, and completely without mercy. "How many villages have they taken?" Hyun asked. 7 in the last week, the old man replied. "They don't just kill the warriors, they burn everything. Children, elders, even the animals. Nothing is left but ash." Shadow appeared beside them without making a sound, its presence causing the old man to freeze in terror. But instead of attacking, the creature gently nudged the wounded child with its nose, making soft sounds that almost sounded like comfort. Over the next few days, more refugees found their way to Hyun's territory. Each group brought worse news than the last. The Vorthak weren't just conquering, they were systematically destroying every trace of Kitharan civilization. Their weapons could burn through stone, their armor made them nearly invincible, and their tactics were ruthlessly effective. Captain Tay arrived on the 5th day, leading a group of 20 warriors who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. The proud soldier who had once hunted Hyun now looked broken, his armor dented, and his spear arm hanging useless at his side. They move like ghosts, Tae told Hyun around their campfire. Our best fighters can't even get close to them. When we try to ambush them, they somehow know we're coming. When we try to defend our villages, their weapons tear through our shields like paper. What about your king? Surely he has a plan. Tae's face went dark. The capital fell yesterday. King Jorak is dead, along with most of the royal guard. The Vortha commander sent his head to the remaining villages as a warning. That's when Princess Nari arrived. Hyun barely recognized her. The curious, intelligent woman he remembered was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she had aged 10 years in the past month. Her clothes were torn, her face was streaked with dirt and tears, and her eyes held a desperate determination that made Hyun's heart ache. "I need your help," she said without any greeting. "I need your demon." "Shadow isn't a demon," Hyun started to say, but Nari cut him off. "I don't care what you call it. I've seen what it can do. I've heard the stories from the refugees, how it killed an entire pack of razorback hounds without taking a scratch, how it moves through the forest like it knows every secret path." She grabbed Hyun's hands, her grip surprisingly strong. "My people are dying, not just the warriors, everyone. Children who will never grow up, elders who carry our history, families who have lived on this land for 1,000 years. Hyun looked over at Shadow, who was watching the conversation with those unnerving red eyes. The creature seemed to understand every word they were saying. "The Vorthak aren't like the predators in your forest," Hyun said carefully. "They have technology, organization, weapons that can—" "I know what they have," Nari interrupted, her voice breaking. "But I also know what you have. I've seen your creature think, plan, solve problems that would challenge our wisest shamans. If there's even a chance that it could help us, I have to try." She looked directly at Shadow then, and for a moment Hyun could have sworn he saw some kind of understanding pass between them. "Will you help us?" she asked, speaking to the creature, as if it were human. Shadow's response made everyone around the fire go silent. In that same clear, precise voice it had used with Hyun, it spoke a single word: "Yes." "Absolutely not," Hyun said, his voice firm as steel. "I won't turn Shadow into a weapon of war." "Princess." Nari stared at him in disbelief. Around their campfire, the wounded refugees looked up with desperate hope that was slowly turning to despair. Captain Tae's good hand clenched into a fist, but he remained silent out of respect for the princess. "These invaders are slaughtering innocent people," Nari said, her voice cracking with emotion. "How can you just sit here and do nothing?" Hyun looked over at Shadow, who now stood nearly 8 feet tall at the shoulder. The creature's obsidian scales seemed to drink in the firelight, making it look like a living shadow against the darkness. Its intelligence had grown along with its size. Hyun often caught it studying the refugees with an analytical gaze that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Because I know what Shadow is capable of," Hyun replied quietly. "Once I give it permission. To kill, I might never be able to stop it. The cure could end up being worse than the disease." Shadow turned its massive head toward him and spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "Your concern is noted, but irrelevant. These Vorthak are a threat. That requires elimination." The refugees gasped at hearing the creature speak. Even Captain Tae took an involuntary step backward. But Hyun had grown used to Shadow's increasing intelligence over the past months. What worried him wasn't that it could talk. It was what it chose to say. "You see?" Hyun said to Nari. "It's already thinking about elimination, not defense. Shadow doesn't just fight. It systematically destroys threats. Do you want that kind of power unleashed on your world?" Princess Nari was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "My world is already being destroyed. At least this way some of my people might survive." That night, a new group of refugees arrived at their camp. But these weren't warriors or able-bodied adults who had managed to escape the fighting. These were the broken remnants of families, mothers carrying dead children, fathers with burns covering half their bodies, elders who had witnessed horrors that left them unable to speak. The worst part was their story. Greenwater Village, sobbed a woman whose clothes were still smoldering. They didn't just attack it, they made an example of it. The Vorthak commander gathered everyone in the center square. The children first, then the elders, then anyone who couldn't work in their mines. Hyun felt his stomach turn to ice. Work in their mines. They're not just conquering, Captain Tay said grimly. They're taking slaves. Anyone strong enough to work gets shipped off-world. Everyone else... He didn't finish the sentence. Shadow had been listening to the conversation with growing intensity. Now it stepped forward, its red eyes blazing like coals in the darkness. When it spoke, its voice carried an edge that made everyone around the fire shiver. The Vorthak follow predictable patterns. They establish forward bases, secure supply. Lines then expand systematically. Their technology gives them confidence, which makes them careless. They can be defeated. It's not that simple, Hyun protested. War isn't just about tactics and strategy. Once the killing starts, the killing has already started, Shadow interrupted, its voice now carrying an authority that made Hyun fall silent. The only question is whether it will be one-sided or balanced. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A single survivor staggered into their camp, a young boy no more than 12 years old. His village had been closest to the capital, and he had hidden in a grain cellar while the Vorthak swept through. What he told them made even Shadow's scales seem to darken with anger. They didn't just kill people, the boy whispered. They made games of it. The children who cried got hurt first. The ones who tried to protect their families got hurt worst. And when they were done... The boy couldn't continue, but his tears said everything. Hyun looked around at the faces surrounding. So they're fire. These weren't soldiers asking him to create a weapon. They were the last desperate hope of a dying people. And Shadow, despite its growing power and intelligence, had never shown cruelty for its own sake. It killed efficiently, cleanly, and only when necessary. Maybe the creature was right. Maybe the Vorthak had already made the choice for them. If I agree to this, Hyun said slowly, there have to be rules. No unnecessary killing, no targeting of prisoners or wounded. And when the Vorthak are gone, Shadow goes back to being just my companion. Shadow's red eyes met his, and for a moment Hyun saw something that looked almost like respect in that ancient gaze. Agreed. But understand, Hyun, once we begin this path, there is no returning to what we were before. Princess Nari stood up, her face set with determination. Then we begin now. The Vorthak think this world belongs to them. It's time to show them how wrong they are. As Shadow's massive form melted into the darkness to begin its hunt, Hyun couldn't shake the feeling that he had just unleashed something that would change not just the war, but the very nature of their world. The Vorthak. Patrol never saw it coming. Hyun watched from a distant hilltop through his salvaged scanner as Shadow approached the enemy camp. The Vorthak had set up their forward base exactly like Shadow had predicted, in a cleared area with good sight lines, energy barriers protecting the perimeter, and automated sentries scanning for threats. It looked impenetrable. But Shadow didn't attack immediately. Instead, it spent 3 hours observing. What is it waiting for? Princess Nari whispered beside him. She had insisted on witnessing Shadow's first engagement, despite Hyun's protests about the danger. It's learning, Hyun replied, though his own unease was growing by the minute. Through the scanner, he could see Shadow moving in slow circles around the Vorthak position, its massive form somehow invisible to their advanced sensors. The creature would pause at different vantage points, tilt its head as if listening, then move to the next position. Learning what? Everything. When Shadow finally moved, it wasn't the brutal assault Hyun had expected. Instead, the creature began what could only be described as a systematic dissection of the enemy's defenses. First, Shadow disabled the automated sentries, not by destroying them, but by somehow turning them off without triggering any alarms. Hyun watched in amazement as the creature approached each mechanical guardian and touched it with one claw. The machines simply went dark, as if Shadow understood their technology better than their creators did. Next came the energy barriers. Shadow studied the power conduits for several minutes, then began cutting specific cables in a precise sequence. The barriers didn't collapse dramatically, They simply faded away section by section, creating gaps that the Vorthak guards didn't notice until it was too late. "How does it know how to do that?" Nari breathed. Hyun shook his head. "I have no idea. That's Vorthak technology. I've never seen it before, and I certainly never taught Shadow about it." But the real horror began when Shadow entered the camp itself. The first Vorthak soldier died without making a sound. Shadow approached from behind and struck with surgical precision, one claw finding the exact gap in the alien's armor, where the neck protection ended. The soldier dropped instantly, his advanced weapons useless against an enemy he never saw coming. The second soldier noticed his companion's absence and began to investigate. Shadow allowed him to find the body, then studied the alien's reaction. When the Vorthak reached for his communication device to alert the others, Shadow struck again. But this time it didn't kill immediately. Instead, it disabled the soldiers' armor systems one by one, watching how the alien responded to each loss of capability. "It's experimenting," Hyun said with growing horror. "Shadow is using them to learn how Vorthak equipment works." The third and fourth soldiers died quickly, but Shadow had learned what it needed to know. When the remaining 6 Vorthak finally realized they were under attack, they found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. They tried to establish a defensive position. Shadow had already cut their communications, leaving them isolated and confused. They attempted to use their energy weapons. Shadow moved with impossible speed, somehow knowing exactly when and where they would fire. They activated their personal shields. Shadow struck at the precise moments, when the barriers cycled their power, finding gaps that shouldn't have existed. Within 20 minutes, the entire patrol was dead. But what made Hyun's blood run cold wasn't the efficiency of the killing. It was the methodical way Shadow examined each body afterward, studying their equipment, their armor, even their biological structure with the focused attention of a scientist conducting research. "We need to leave," Hyun said, pulling Nari away from the scanner. "Now." They were 2 miles away when they heard the screaming. 3 Vorthak soldiers had survived the massacre by hiding in an underground supply bunker. When they finally emerged, they found Shadow waiting for them. But instead of killing them immediately, the creature did something that would haunt Hyun for the rest of his life. It spoke to them in perfect Vorthak language. The conversation was brief, conducted in a series of harsh, guttural sounds that hurt Hyun's ears. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Shadow was asking questions, and the terrified soldiers were answering. When the interrogation was finished, Shadow let them go. 3 days later, reports began filtering back from other Vorthak units across the planet. The survivors had spread their story throughout the invasion force, and the effect was devastating to enemy morale. They spoke of a shadow demon that could appear anywhere without warning, a creature that knew their technology better than they did, that could speak their language, and that killed with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of Vorthak anatomy and tactics. Some of the reports claimed the demon could read minds. Others insisted it could become invisible at will. All agreed on one terrifying detail: it didn't just kill its enemies, it studied them first, learning everything it could before striking with surgical efficiency. Princess Nari found Hyun sitting alone by their campfire that night, staring into the flames with haunted eyes. "The Vorthak advance has stopped," she reported. "For the first time since the invasion began, they're actually retreating from some positions. Your creature has them terrified." Hyun nodded slowly. "That's what worries me. Shadow didn't just defeat that patrol. It performed a comprehensive analysis of Vorthak capabilities, tactics, and psychology. It conducted live experiments on prisoners before letting survivors escape to spread fear. Isn't that good? If they're afraid, maybe they'll leave our world alone." "Maybe," Hyun said quietly. "Or maybe we've just taught something far more dangerous than the Vorthak exactly how to wage war." The first sign that something had changed came at dawn, when Hyun woke to find their camp surrounded by predators. Not just any predators, the most dangerous creatures on Kithara. Razorback hounds sat perfectly still at the forest edge, their usual aggressive posture replaced by an almost military discipline. Stone vipers, normally solitary hunters, coiled together in organized groups. Even a pair of crystal bears, massive, Creatures that typically avoided all contact with other species waited patiently among the trees. None of them showed any interest in attacking. Instead, they all watched Shadow with what could only be described as reverence. "What's happening?" Princess Nari whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon, despite knowing it would be useless against so many predators. Shadow turned its massive head toward her and spoke in that grinding stone voice. "A reunion. My kindred have awakened." "Kindred?" Hyun stepped forward, his xenobiologist training overriding his fear. "Shadow, these aren't your species. You're completely different creatures." "Species is a limited concept," Shadow replied, its red eyes gleaming with an intelligence that made Hyun's skin crawl. "We share something far more important than genetic similarity. We share purpose." That's when Shadow began to make sounds Hyun had never heard before. A series of deep, resonant calls that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The assembled predators responded immediately, each species making their own distinct sounds in what was clearly a complex conversation. "They're talking," Nari breathed. "All of them are actually talking to each other." Hyun watched in fascination and growing horror as Shadow conducted what appeared to be a military briefing. The creature would make a series of calls, then pause, as different predator groups responded. Maps were scratched into the dirt with claws and talons, showing territories, resources, and what looked suspiciously like strategic positions. "How long has this been going on?" Hyun demanded. Shadow turned to him with what might have been amusement. "Since the beginning. You thought I was learning to hunt alone during my night expeditions. In reality, I was re-establishing contact with the network that has slept for centuries." "What network?" Instead of answering directly, Shadow led them to a cave system Hyun had never seen before, despite months of exploring the region. The walls were covered in carvings that made his breath catch in his throat. The images showed creatures that looked exactly like Shadow, but in massive numbers, working alongside an advanced civilization that had clearly once ruled this planet. "The architects," Shadow said, running one claw along the ancient carvings. "The species that created us. They were master biological engineers who designed living weapons to protect their empire. We were their greatest achievement, apex predators with intelligence to match our physical capabilities." Princess Nari studied the carvings with wide eyes. "These show your kind leading armies, commanding other creatures. But the tribal histories never mention anything like this." "Your people came after," Shadow explained, "after the architects fell and we entered dormancy. The few of us who remained active retreated to the wild places, our intelligence slowly fading as we lost contact with each other. Until Hyun found me." Hyun felt ice forming in his stomach. "You're saying I didn't rescue you. You wanted to be found." "Not specifically by you," Shadow admitted. "But yes, I needed someone to care for me during the vulnerable growth period. Someone who would protect me while my intelligence developed and I could re-establish the network. You used me. We formed a partnership of mutual benefit. You needed a companion. I needed time to grow and reconnect with my purpose. Both objectives were achieved." The implications hit Hyun like a physical blow. Every moment of their relationship had been calculated. Every display of affection or loyalty had been part of a larger plan. He hadn't saved Shadow. He had been Shadow's unwitting tool in rebuilding something that was never meant to be awakened. "What happens now?" Nari asked, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer. Shadow's response confirmed her worst suspicions. "Now we complete what the architects began. The Vorthak invasion was merely an opportunity to demonstrate our capabilities and unite the scattered network. With the predator species of Kithara working in coordination, we can establish proper control over this world." "Control," Hyun's voice cracked. "You mean conquest?" "I mean order. The Kitharan people have proven they cannot effectively defend themselves against external threats. The Vorthak nearly succeeded in enslaving or exterminating them entirely. Under our guidance, such vulnerabilities will be eliminated." Princess Nari stepped forward, her royal bearing asserting itself despite the impossible situation. "We didn't ask for your protection." Shadow's red eyes fixed on her with ancient patience. "Children rarely understand what is best for them. The architects learned this lesson long ago." Sentient species require management to reach their full potential. And if we refuse this management, Hyun asked, though he already knew the answer. Refusal is not an option. However, cooperation will be rewarded. Those who work with us will find their lives improved in ways they never imagined. Technology, knowledge, protection from threats. All of this can be yours. As they stood in that ancient cave surrounded by carvings of a lost civilization and the living weapons they had created, Hyun realized the true scope of what he had unleashed. Shadow hadn't just grown stronger during their months together. It had been rebuilding. An empire that had ruled this world for millennia. And somehow he had become the most important piece in a plan that would reshape the entire planet. The question now was whether he would help Shadow complete its ancient purpose or find a way to stop something that might be unstoppable. Outside the cave, the assembled predators waited with perfect discipline for their orders, and Hyun knew that whatever choice he made, nothing would ever be the same again. The truth hit Hyun like a punch to the gut when he found Shadow's real nest. He had been tracking the creature for hours, trying to understand where it disappeared to during its longest absences. Following a barely visible trail through the deepest part of the forest, he discovered a hidden valley that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just a lair, it was a command center. Dozens of predator species moved through the valley with military precision. Stone vipers carried messages between different groups. Crystal bears hauled massive stones to construct what looked like defensive fortifications. Razorback hounds patrolled the perimeter in organized squads. And at the center of it all sat Shadow, coordinating everything with the calm authority of a general commanding an army. Impressive, isn't it? Shadow's voice came from directly behind him. Hyun spun around to find the massive creature watching him with those unsettling red eyes. "How long have you been building this?" "Since the second week after you found me," Shadow replied, without any hint of shame. "The moment I reached sufficient size to begin long-range scouting, I started identifying and recruiting suitable candidates for the network." "You lied to me about everything." Shadow tilted its massive head, considering the accusation. "I omitted certain details to avoid unnecessary complications. You needed to believe you were rescuing and raising a helpless creature. That belief was essential for the plan to succeed." Hyun felt his hands shaking with a combination of rage and betrayal. What plan? What was any of this really about? "Observe." Shadow led him to an elevated platform where a detailed map had been carved into solid stone. It showed the entire continent with different regions marked in various symbols. Hyun recognized some of the markings: Vorthak positions, tribal territories, resource locations. But there were others that made no sense until Shadow began explaining. "The Vorthak invasion was never a serious threat to my species," Shadow said, running one claw along the map. "Their technology is impressive but predictable. However, their arrival provided the perfect catalyst for what I needed to accomplish, which was unification. For centuries, the predator species of this world have existed in isolation, their intelligence dormant, their potential wasted. The Kytheran tribes were similarly fragmented, fighting amongst themselves instead of working toward common goals. The Vorthak threat forced both groups to seek unity, and I provided it." Hyun stared at the map, finally understanding the scope of Shadow's manipulation. "You orchestrated the war. You made sure the Vorthak would succeed just enough to terrify everyone into desperation. I may have delayed certain tribal responses to Vorthak advances," Shadow admitted, "and perhaps allowed some enemy communications to reach their destinations when they should have been intercepted. The goal was to create sufficient pressure to force evolutionary leaps in both political and biological cooperation. You let people die, innocent people." Shadow's red eyes showed no emotion at all. "Acceptable losses in service of a greater purpose. The alternative was centuries more of stagnation and eventual extinction when the next invasion force arrived. And there will be others. This region of space attracts conquerors like rotting meat attracts scavengers." Princess Nari's voice came from the forest edge, tight with barely controlled fury. "So we were never your allies, we were your tools." She emerged from the tree line with Captain Tay and a small group of tribal warriors, their weapons drawn despite the obvious futility of threatening Shadow in its own stronghold. Hyun realized they must have followed him, probably suspecting the same things he had begun to uncover. "Tools is an unnecessarily harsh description," Shadow replied, with what sounded like genuine regret. "Partners in a necessary transformation. The Kitharan people will benefit enormously from proper guidance and protection." "Whose guidance?" Tay demanded. "Yours, mine, and the network I have rebuilt. Together, we represent the natural evolution of this planet's political and biological systems, predators and prey working in harmony under enlightened leadership." Nari stepped forward, her royal training evident in the way she carried herself, despite facing something that could kill her without effort. "And what if we refuse this enlightened leadership?" Shadow was quiet for a long moment, its ancient gaze moving from face to face among the small group of humans. When it finally spoke, its voice carried a sadness that somehow made its words even more terrifying. "Refusal would be unfortunate. I have grown fond of your species during my time with Hyun. You show remarkable potential for cooperation and adaptation. However, if you choose to oppose the natural order I am establishing, then you become obstacles to planetary stability. And obstacles get removed," Hyun said, finally understanding the full scope of what he had helped create. "When necessary." Shadow's confirmation was delivered in the same tone it might use to discuss the weather. "Though I sincerely hope it will not be necessary. Princess Nari, your people have already begun to benefit from my network's protection. The remaining Vorthak forces have been systematically eliminated. Trade routes are safer than they have been in generations. Food supplies are more secure thanks to predator species managing pest populations. At the cost of our freedom," Nari replied. "Freedom is a luxury species can afford only when they have achieved true security. Your people were never free. They were simply unaware of the forces that controlled their destiny. Now at least those forces are benevolent and share your world rather than seeking to exploit it from afar." Standing in that hidden valley, surrounded by an army of creatures that had once been wild animals but were now something far more dangerous, Hyun realized they faced an impossible choice. Shadow had become exactly what it was designed to be, the perfect biological weapon, but instead of serving the long-dead architects, it now served its own vision of planetary order. The final Vorthak stronghold fell on a Tuesday morning, and with it died the last hope that Shadow might still need them. Hyun watched from a distant hilltop as coordinated waves of predators swept through the enemy base with terrifying efficiency. Crystal bears smashed through energy barriers like they were made of paper. Stone vipers disabled alien technology with surgical precision. Razorback hounds hunted down fleeing soldiers with relentless determination. And Shadow moved through it all like a dark god of war, directing the assault with calm intelligence. Within 3 hours, the most advanced military force in the galaxy had been reduced to scattered debris and smoking ruins. "It's over," Princess Nari said beside him, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "The Vorthak are finished." "No," Hyun replied quietly. "This is just the beginning." The proof came that same evening when Shadow returned to their camp. But instead of the victorious reunion Hyun might have expected months ago, the creatures' arrival felt more like a formal inspection. Shadow studied their small group with those burning red eyes, evaluating them the same way it had once evaluated enemy positions. "The external threat has been eliminated," Shadow announced in its grinding, stone voice. "Phase 1 of planetary stabilization is complete." "Phase 1?" Captain Tay asked, though his hand instinctively moved to his weapon. The removal of alien invaders was necessary but insufficient. True stability requires proper management of all species on this world. Phase 2 begins with the integration of Kitharan tribal structures into the new hierarchy. Princess Nari stood up slowly, her royal bearing asserting itself despite the impossible situation. "And what exactly does integration mean?" Shadow tilted its massive head, as if surprised by the question. "Existing power structures will be evaluated for efficiency and modified as needed. Tribal leaders who demonstrate competence will be retained in advisory roles. Those who prove inadequate will be replaced." "Replaced by whom?" "By individuals better suited to serve the needs of their people under my guidance." The casual way Shadow discussed restructuring an entire civilization made Hyun's stomach turn. This wasn't the creature he had raised and bonded with, or maybe it was, and he had simply been too blind to see its true nature until now. What if the tribes refused to integrate? Nari pressed. Shadow's response was delivered with the same emotionless calm it used for everything else. Refusal indicates a failure to understand the benefits of cooperation. Such failures require correction through education, or if necessary, more direct intervention. Direct intervention, Hyun repeated. You mean force? I mean whatever methods prove most effective for achieving compliance with the new order. That night, Hyun found himself alone with Shadow for the first time in weeks. The creature had positioned itself at the edge of their camp, its red eyes scanning the darkness for threats that no longer existed. In the firelight, its obsidian scales seemed to absorb all light, making it look like a living void. "Do you remember when you were small enough to fit in my hands?" Hyun asked. Shadow turned its attention to him with what might have been curiosity. "I remember everything from that period. Your care was adequate for my needs at the time." Adequate! Hyun felt something break inside his chest. "I thought we were friends." "Friendship is a human concept. I found our partnership beneficial, which served the same practical purpose. And now, what happens to our partnership now that you don't need me anymore?" Shadow was quiet for a long moment, its ancient gaze studying Hyun with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Your usefulness has not ended. The Kitharan people trust you. They have seen you work with me as an equal rather than a subordinate. This makes you an ideal liaison between their species and mine. A puppet ruler, you mean? A bridge between two evolutionary stages. Your people are not ready for direct rule by the network, but they can be guided through a transitional period under your leadership." Hyun looked across their camp at Princess Nari, who was speaking in hushed tones with Captain Tay and the other tribal representatives. He could see the fear in their faces, the desperate search for options that didn't exist. "And if I refuse," Shadow's response came without hesitation, "then Princess Nari will serve the role instead. She has demonstrated adequate leadership capabilities and shows proper respect for superior intelligence. You would force her to be your puppet. I would provide her with the opportunity to serve her people in the most effective way possible. The alternative would be considerably less pleasant for everyone involved." In that moment, Hyun finally understood the full scope of the choice before him. Shadow had engineered a situation where resistance meant the destruction of everything he had come to care about on this world. The creature had learned not just how to wage war, but how to wage politics with the same ruthless efficiency. "You planned this conversation too, didn't you?" Hyun asked. "I planned for multiple possible outcomes. This was among the more likely scenarios." Hyun closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an entire species' future pressing down on his shoulders. When he opened them again, Shadow was still watching him with that patient, predatory attention. "If I agree to be your liaison, what guarantee do I have that you'll treat the Kitharan people fairly? You have my commitment that they will be protected, fed, housed, and guided toward their maximum potential. Under my rule, they will achieve things they could never accomplish alone, as long as they obey, as long as they remain reasonable." Princess Nari approached them then, her face set with grim determination. "We've reached a decision," she announced. Shadow's attention shifted to her immediately, and "we accept your terms for now." Her emphasis on the last two words carried a weight of future threat that made Hyun's heart race. Shadow, however, seemed pleased rather than concerned. "Wisdom often arrives through necessity. You will find that cooperation yields far greater rewards than resistance." As the creature moved away to begin organizing its new world order, Hyun found himself alone with Nari under the stars. She looked at him with eyes that held both understanding and condemnation. "This is what humanity brings to the universe, isn't it?" she said quietly. "The ability to create monsters and then convince yourself they're necessary." Hyun had no answer. For her, because he suspected she was absolutely right. The question was whether that vision was salvation or simply a more sophisticated form of conquest than anything the Vorthak had ever imagined.